The war room smelled of burnt metal and old fear. General Sova stood over a table made of light, watching 50 small dots blink on a map of a system nobody in the Threshold Accord had bothered to study closely until now. She had spent 30 years fighting weaker species that broke and bargained the moment their homeworlds were threatened. Humans were different, or so the border reports claimed, and Sova hated reports that could not be trusted. She turned to the officer beside her, a young tactician named Rel who had built his career studying enemy psychology instead of enemy weapons. Most commanders thought that made him soft. Sova thought it made him useful. 50 scouts, Sova said. Our best. Cloaked ships, no contact until extraction. I want to know how they live, how they fight, and most of all, why they keep winning battles they should lose on paper. Rel nodded slowly. The reports say human soldiers do not fight like trained soldiers. They fight like something got taken from them personally, every single time, even when nothing was taken. I do not know what that means yet. Find out, Sova said, quietly. The 50 scouts came from a unit called the Silent Talons, chosen for patience rather than aggression. Their training taught them to disappear into rock, into shadow, into silence itself. Each one carried a small device that recorded everything and sent short bursts of data home once a week. None of them expected resistance. Their orders were simple: watch, record, leave no trace. One of them was a young scout named Doran, barely out of training, chosen because his scores in stealth and patience were the highest in a decade. Doran did not want glory. He wanted to prove that careful work mattered more than bravery, a lesson his father had failed to teach him before dying on a battlefield that bravery alone could not win. The ships broke atmosphere in 50 different places, spread across 3 human colonies and 1 core world. From orbit, the Accord's sensors painted a picture of a young, disorganized civilization: farms without proper walls, cities without deep bunkers, ships that looked patched together instead of manufactured. Sova's staff felt a flicker of relief at these images. Perhaps the reports had been exaggerated after all. Doran landed near a small farming town at night, his suit tuned to match the color of wet soil. He moved between fields for 3 days, recording irrigation patterns, food storage, and the rough schedules of the people who worked the land. He noted that the farmers carried tools that could double as weapons, but so did farmers on 100 other worlds. Nothing alarmed him yet. On the 4th night he found something strange. A wooden marker stood at the edge of a field, carved with names and dates. Beside it, someone had planted flowers that had no practical use, no medicinal value, nothing the Accord's databases could explain. Doran recorded it anyway, unsure why it mattered, only certain that it did. Elsewhere across the system, other scouts sent back pieces of the same puzzle. A scout near the core world reported that human children were taught combat basics not for war, but so they would never feel helpless, a phrase repeated in schools that made no sense to a species raised on calm submission to authority. Another scout watched a hospital ship dock at a damage station, unloading doctors who had traveled 2 full days for strangers they would never meet again. Sova read these reports with growing unease. None of it matched the picture of an easy, disorganized species. It matched something else entirely, something her doctrine had no name for. Back on the farm world, Doran began to hear rumors among the workers, carried in the accent of people who did not know they were being listened to. They spoke of a border skirmish weeks earlier, small and unremarkable by any military standard, yet the entire town still talked about it like it had happened yesterday. A young pilot named Talia had died defending a supply convoy that, by every calculation Doran could run, was not worth the risk she took to protect it. He did not understand why her name was spoken with such weight. He did not understand why a memorial with no strategic value stood untouched at the edge of a field. But he wrote it all down, because that was his job, and because some quiet part of him suspected that understanding it might matter more than any weapon count or fleet position ever could. On the 7th night, Doran packed his gear to move toward a new observation point, unaware that 17 scouts across the system had already gone silent, their last transmissions cut off mid-sentence, their locations marked but unexplained. Command back home had not yet noticed the pattern. Doran had no way of knowing that he was already being watched, not by machines, but by people who had learned, over generations of hard loss, exactly how to find something trying very hard not to be found. He crossed the tree line just before dawn, and for the first time since landing, he felt the skin on the back of his neck prickle with a warning his training had never prepared him for. Rain fell over the ruins of a mining outpost 3 systems away, and a scout named Ivo crouched under a collapsed loading crane, watching human engineers work through the storm without complaint. He had been assigned to study human industry, specifically how they repaired equipment that, by Accord standards, should have been scrapped years ago. What he found unsettled him more than any weapon test could have. The engineers were not simply fixing machines. They were rebuilding them by hand, arguing over designs, laughing at failed attempts, and trying again without anyone ordering them to. No supervisor stood over them with threats or rewards. They worked like the outcome mattered to them personally, as if the outpost belonged to something inside themselves rather than to a distant government. Ivo sent a short report home describing this behavior as inefficient but oddly effective. He did not yet understand that he was describing loyalty, a concept the Accord trained out of its citizens generations ago in favor of obedience. Meanwhile, on the farm world, Doran moved deeper into human territory, following supply routes toward a small military post. He kept low, using the storm as cover, confident in a stealth suit that had never failed him in training. He did not know that human trackers along the border had grown suspicious of strange animal behavior near the fields, birds scattering from empty ground, dogs barking at nothing visible. Humans had learned long ago to trust these small signs, a skill built from centuries of hunting, farming, and surviving on a planet that never made things easy for them. A woman named Nora led the local militia, a mixed group of farmers, retired soldiers, and teenagers eager to prove themselves. She had grown up hearing stories about strange lights near the border and had stopped dismissing them as legend. When her dogs refused to settle near the tree line for the 3rd night in a row, she gathered 6 volunteers and moved out before sunrise. Doran, unaware of the search closing in, paused near a ridge to record troop movements at the post below. He noted their formations, their weapons, their rotation schedules. Everything matched what earlier scouts had already reported. Humans fought in small, flexible groups instead of large formations, trusting individual judgment over strict command. It made them harder to predict, but Doran still believed patience would keep him safe. He was wrong. Nora's group found faint disturbances in the mud, small enough that most trackers would miss them, but not small enough to escape people who had tracked deer and wolves their entire lives. They followed the trail in silence, spreading out instead of walking together, another instinct built from generations of survival rather than formal training. By the time Doran realized he was not alone, it was almost too late. He caught a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision and dropped low, heart pounding in a way his training had never fully prepared him for. He activated a distress signal, a short burst meant only for emergency extraction, then began moving away from the post as quietly as his suit allowed. Nora's team split further, cutting off 2 possible retreat paths based on nothing but instinct and the shape of the land. One of the younger militia members, a boy barely older than Doran himself, spotted a shimmer in the air where light bent slightly wrong. He did not shoot. Instead, he called out calmly, telling whoever was hiding there that running would only make things worse. Doran froze, torn between his training to avoid contact at all costs and the growing certainty that avoidance was no longer possible. He chose to run. The chase that followed was short, brutal, and entirely unlike anything his simulations had modeled. The humans did not fire wildly or panic. They moved with quiet coordination, cutting off angles, calling soft signals to each other that Doran's translator struggled to keep up with. He realized with a cold shock that they were not hunting him like an enemy soldier. They were hunting him like a threat to their home, and that distinction changed everything about how they moved. He barely escaped through a narrow ravine, diving into a stream to break the trail, lungs burning, suit damaged, extraction signal blinking uselessly with no response yet received. Behind him, he heard Nora's voice carry clearly through the rain, not angry, not afraid, simply certain. "Whatever you are," she said, "you should have stayed home." Doran did not answer. He kept moving, shaken by how close he had come to capture, and more shaken by the realization that the humans had not needed advanced technology to nearly catch him. They had needed only patience, cooperation, and a fierce, unshakable will to protect a small, unremarkable piece of land that meant everything to them. Far above, in orbit, the Accord fleet continued waiting for reports that were slowly, silently, beginning to stop. Aboard the command ship Solace, General Sova stared at a wall of status lights, most of them dimmed to a dull red that meant no contact. 29 scouts had gone silent in the last 10 days, far more than any acceptable margin of error. She had spent her career trusting numbers over instinct, but the numbers now told a story her instincts refused to accept. Something down there was hunting her people, and doing it well. Rel stood beside her, reviewing the last recorded messages from missing scouts. A pattern had emerged, one he almost did not want to believe. Every scout who vanished had gotten close to something humans clearly valued beyond its practical worth. A memorial, a hospital, a school, a single wounded soldier being carried by friends who refused to leave him behind even under fire. "They are not defending resources," Rel said quietly. "They are defending meaning, and they seem to sense anything that threatens it, even when nothing threatens it directly." Sova frowned. "Explain." "I think," Rel said, "our scouts were never in danger from human weapons. They were in danger from human attention. These people notice everything near what they care about, and they do not need orders to act on it." Sova found this explanation almost insulting in its simplicity, yet she could not disprove it. She authorized a change in tactics. Remaining scouts would avoid populated areas entirely, focusing only on remote infrastructure and fleet movements. She hoped distance would restore the safety their doctrine promised. On the ground, a scout named Callum tested this new caution near an automated shipyard far from any settlement. He believed isolation would finally give him the safety his training predicted. For 2 days, his reports were calm and steady, filled with technical details about hull construction and engine output. Then he made a mistake. He lingered too long near a maintenance crew repairing a damaged transport, watching them work through exhaustion rather than retreat once their scheduled task was finished. He recorded their conversation out of curiosity rather than necessity, unaware that one worker, a woman named Priya, had grown suspicious of a faint shimmer near the scaffolding, the same distortion pattern that had already been reported by border militias weeks earlier. Priya did not panic. She quietly informed her crew lead, who informed a small security team stationed nearby for reasons that had nothing to do with alien scouts and everything to do with routine sabotage risks from rival companies. It did not matter. The result was the same. Callum's transmission ended mid-sentence less than an hour later. Back on the Solace, Sova received this report with a stillness that unsettled the entire bridge crew. It confirmed something she had begun to suspect but had refused to say aloud. Humans did not need specialized hunters to find her scouts. Ordinary humans, doing ordinary jobs, noticed enough and acted decisively enough to end a mission on their own. Rel requested access to older Accord archives, searching for any precedent among the dozens of species the Coalition had previously studied. He found nothing close. Every other species reacted to threats with calculated caution, weighing risk against reward before acting. Humans seemed to weigh almost nothing. They simply acted, immediately and without hesitation, whenever something they valued felt threatened, regardless of the danger to themselves. He began drafting a private note, separate from the official record, describing a theory he was not yet ready to defend before the council. He believed humans treated every member of their group, every place, every memory, as equally worth protecting, without the usual calculations of usefulness or expendability that governed Accord military doctrine. It made them slow to expand and quick to defend, a combination the Accord strategists had never encountered in such an extreme, consistent form. Meanwhile, deep in human territory, Doran continued moving between hiding spots, his suit barely functioning after the encounter at the ravine. He had stopped trying to gather new intelligence and focused entirely on survival, waiting for an extraction window that seemed to shrink further with each passing day. He listened to human broadcasts whenever he dared, picking up fragments of language and tone that painted a picture far more complicated than any briefing had prepared him for. He heard grief in their voices when speaking of losses, but also a strange, steady resolve that never seemed to break, no matter how much they lost. It was not the mindless aggression the Accord had expected, nor the fragile fear of a young, disorganized species. It was something closer to devotion, spread evenly across an entire civilization, and Doran was beginning to understand with growing dread that this devotion was the true weapon nobody back home had accounted for. By the time he reached his next hiding place, only 12 status lights remained active on the Solace's board, and Sova had begun quietly preparing for a mission that no longer resembled reconnaissance at all. The forest near the eastern ridge had gone quiet in a way that made even the birds nervous, and a scout named Finn pressed himself flat against a fallen log, watching a group of human soldiers move through the trees below. He had survived longer than most, 23 days in the field, mostly by avoiding people entirely and living off stored rations rather than risking contact for supplies. He had watched 3 other scouts get caught in the past week, their capture broadcast briefly on encrypted human channels before going silent, likely a warning meant for anyone else listening. Finn no longer believed patience alone would save him. He needed a plan to reach extraction, still 2 days away on foot through territory that seemed to grow more hostile with every mile. Below him, the soldiers moved differently than any human unit he had studied before. They spoke rarely, using hand signals that shifted subtly whenever they suspected they were being observed, as if adapting their own tactics in real time based on lessons learned from earlier encounters with his kind. Finn realized with a chill that these were not soldiers hunting an abstract threat. They were soldiers hunting him specifically, using patterns built from the mistakes of scouts who had come before. He backed away slowly, careful not to disturb the underbrush, and began moving toward a river he hoped would break his trail. As he moved, he thought about a briefing document he had read before launch, one that described humans as unpredictable but ultimately manageable, prone to emotional decisions that could be exploited. Nothing he had seen in 3 weeks matched that description. If anything, their emotions seemed to sharpen their decisions rather than weaken them. Meanwhile, Doran had reached a small abandoned station near the coast, one of the last known safe points before the extraction zone. He arrived exhausted, his suit barely holding together, and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. It was there that he encountered someone he did not expect, a lone human soldier named Owen, resting inside the same station, unaware that anything unusual shared the space with him. Doran could have stayed hidden. His training demanded it. Instead, driven by exhaustion and a strange, growing curiosity, he made a choice that broke every protocol he had ever learned. He let his suit's camouflage flicker just enough to be noticed, testing whether this single human would react the way the others had. Owen did not attack immediately. He stared at the shimmering shape in the corner of the room, weapon raised but steady, waiting. When Doran finally deactivated his camouflage completely, revealing himself fully, Owen's expression shifted from alarm to something closer to weary recognition, as if he had expected this moment eventually. "You're one of the Watchers," Owen said quietly. "We've found 6 of you this month." Doran said nothing, unsure whether silence or honesty would serve him better. Owen lowered his weapon slightly, though not fully, studying him with open curiosity rather than hatred. "You people keep coming to see how we fight," Owen continued. "You never ask why." The question caught Doran off guard. In dozens of reports, hundreds of hours of observation, no one had ever framed it that way. He had spent 3 weeks documenting how humans fought, never once considering that the reason might matter as much as the method. Owen did not offer a full explanation, only a fragment, spoken as if it were obvious. He said humans did not fight to win efficiently. They fought to make sure the people and places they loved were still there afterward, no matter the cost to themselves. It was not strategy. It was refusal, a stubborn, collective refusal to accept loss as something to be calculated and accepted. Doran wanted to ask more, but the moment shattered when a second patrol approached outside, their voices carrying through the thin station walls. Owen's expression hardened again, torn between duty and the strange, quiet exchange that had just passed between them. "Go," Owen said finally, stepping aside. "Tell your people what you saw here. Maybe it saves lives on both sides." Doran hesitated only a moment before slipping past him into the night, his mind reeling from an encounter that made no sense within any framework the Accord had ever taught him. Behind him, he heard Owen calmly explain to the arriving patrol that the area was clear, buying him precious minutes he had not expected to receive. Elsewhere, Finn was not so fortunate. The river failed to break his trail, and by dawn, the last transmission from his position went silent, joining the growing list of names marked lost. Only 2 scouts remained active across the entire system, their signals faint and irregular, flickering against a board that had once glowed with 50 points of confident light. The extraction ship waited in high orbit longer than protocol allowed, its captain ignoring 3 separate orders to withdraw. Her name was Grace, and she had trained several of the scouts personally, including Doran, whom she had once scolded for being too cautious during a routine drill. She refused to leave until she was certain no one else was coming. Doran reached the extraction point on the edge of collapse. His suit failed, his supplies gone, surviving the final stretch on nothing but stubbornness and the strange conversation with Owen still echoing in his mind. When Grace pulled him aboard, she barely recognized him. 3 weeks in human territory had aged him far beyond the calendar. He said almost nothing during the initial ascent, staring out at the shrinking planet below with an expression Grace had never seen on a silent Talon before. It was not fear exactly, though fear lived somewhere in it. It looked closer to grief, the kind that comes from understanding something too large to explain simply. Command debriefing began the moment the ship reached the Solace, and General Sova herself insisted on being present, a break from standard procedure that told everyone in the room how seriously this report would be treated. Doran sat across from her, exhausted, hands trembling slightly, struggling to organize weeks of fragmented observation into something resembling a coherent military assessment. "Give me numbers," Sova said gently, sensing his difficulty. "Troop counts, weapon types, anything measurable." Doran shook his head slowly. "Numbers won't help you understand them. I tried counting everything at first. Formations, patrol schedules, response times. None of it explains why they do what they do." Rel, seated quietly at the edge of the room, leaned forward. "Then explain what you can." Doran spoke for nearly an hour, describing the memorial in the field, the hospital ship that traveled 2 days for strangers, the militia led by a woman who trusted her dogs more than any sensor array, and finally, the soldier named Owen who let him walk free simply, because a strange, unscripted moment of understanding had passed between them. "They don't calculate whether someone is worth saving," Doran said. "They just save them, every time. It doesn't matter if it makes sense on paper. That's not a weakness in their system. It is their system. Sova absorbed this in silence, her mind working through implications that clashed violently with decades of established doctrine. Accord strategy had always assumed that any species, given enough pressure, would eventually make rational sacrifices to preserve the group as a whole. Individuals could be spent, resources could be rationed, borders could be abandoned when the cost grew too high. Humans, based on everything Doran described, refused this logic entirely, treating every individual loss as unacceptable regardless of strategic value. If that's true, Rel said carefully, then a war of attrition would not weaken them. It would only make them more determined at every level all at once. Sova closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of 49 names now marked as lost, each one a scout trained for years, each one gone chasing an understanding that had cost the Accord far more than intelligence data ever could. They knew we were watching, Doran added quietly. Long before we realized it. They didn't panic. They organized, they adapted, and they hunted us using nothing but patience and care for each other. We were never facing an army. We were facing an entire civilization acting like one large, protective family. The room fell silent at that comparison, one that unsettled even the most hardened officers present. Sova finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual, stripped of the confident authority it usually carried. "Prepare a full council session," she said. "Immediate priority. Everyone needs to hear this, not just read it in a summary." As the debriefing ended, Doran remained seated long after the others left, staring at a small data pad showing the last known image of the wooden marker in the field, surrounded by flowers that served no purpose beyond memory. He thought of Owen's parting words, the quiet request to explain what he had seen in hopes of saving lives on both sides. For the first time since landing on that world, Doran allowed himself to hope that understanding, rather than conquest, might be the only path that avoided a war neither side could truly win. Outside, across the border, human patrols continued their quiet, steady watch, unaware that the report of one broken scout was about to change the course of an entire empire's plans. The council chamber aboard the Accord's capital station had not been filled to capacity in over a decade, but news of the failed reconnaissance mission had reached every corner of the coalition within days. Representatives from a dozen member species gathered beneath a domed ceiling that projected a slow, rotating map of human territory, its borders marked in a cautious yellow that no one had bothered to change to red. General Sova stood at the center of the chamber, flanked by Rel and a visibly exhausted Doran, who had insisted on attending despite medical recommendations to rest. Sova began without ceremony, laying out the mission's grim outcome in plain terms. 50 scouts sent, 49 lost, 1 returned, carrying information that contradicted nearly every assumption the Accord had built its expansion strategy upon. A representative from a founding member species, a cautious diplomat named Ison, interrupted early, questioning whether one traumatized survivor's account should carry enough weight to alter coalition policy. Sova had expected this challenge and welcomed it, gesturing for Doran to respond directly rather than through a filtered summary. Doran stepped forward, his voice steadier now than it had been during the initial debriefing, though still carrying the weight of what he had witnessed. He did not describe humans as monsters or heroes. He described them as something the Accord had never accounted for, a species where every individual behaved as though the entire civilization's survival depended on their personal actions, and where that belief was reinforced constantly by the actions of everyone around them. He spoke of the militia leader who trusted instinct over technology, the engineers who repaired impossible machines out of personal pride rather than orders, the hospital ship that crossed dangerous space for strangers, and finally, the soldier who let him go, choosing a quiet act of understanding over a guaranteed capture that would have secured him personal recognition. "They are not simply resilient," Doran said. They are unwilling to stop caring, even when caring costs them everything. That refusal is not a flaw we can exploit. It is the foundation of everything they do. Eisen remained skeptical, arguing that emotional resilience meant little against overwhelming technological force. Rel answered this directly, presenting data gathered from the handful of surviving transmissions, showing human industrial output scaling unpredictably during moments of crisis, far beyond calculated norms, driven not by central planning, but by countless individuals independently deciding to work harder, faster, and longer whenever something they valued was threatened. Attrition assumes a breaking point, Rel said. Every model we've built assumes that enough loss eventually forces submission. Based on everything we've gathered, humans do not have that breaking point in any form our doctrine recognizes. Loss does not weaken their resolve. It seems to deepen it. A long silence followed, broken finally by Sova herself. She reminded the chamber that the mission had been intended purely as reconnaissance, a quiet first step toward eventual expansion into human territory. That plan, she stated plainly, was no longer viable without guaranteeing a catastrophic and prolonged conflict that could weaken the entire coalition far beyond any territorial gain it might offer. Before the Council could reach a formal decision, a new transmission arrived, intercepted from human space and relayed directly into the chamber's display. It was not an attack, nor a threat delivered with anger. It was a calm, clear message from an unnamed human representative, listing the names and last known locations of 49 Accord scouts, each one accompanied by a short, respectful note acknowledging their skill and discipline, even in defeat. The message ended simply, stating that further intrusion into human territory would be met the same way, without exception, and without apology, but also expressing a quiet willingness to speak directly should the Accord ever wish to understand them rather than study them from hiding. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after the message ended, the weight of its calm, deliberate tone settling over representatives who had expected either aggression or fear, and received neither. Sova finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the confident authority she had entered the chamber with hours earlier. She proposed formally that the Accord suspend all reconnaissance and expansion efforts along the human border indefinitely, in favor of establishing careful, direct communication instead. The Council's vote passed with far less resistance than anyone expected. Later that evening, Doran stood alone near an observation window, watching the distant, unremarkable star that human territory orbited. He thought of Owen's parting words, of the flowers beside a wooden marker that served no purpose beyond memory, and of an entire species that had taught him, through cost he would carry for the rest of his life, that some civilizations could not be measured by strength alone, only by how fiercely and how quietly they refused to let each other go.